Hi, welcome to Hacking Capitalism. This is episode 6. My name is Todd Bonnewell. You can find more about me at todd.bonnewell.com.
And my name is Joe Blankenship. You can find out more about me at thejoeblankenship.com.
Thanks, Joe. We're going to kick this off here talking about data as a resource. This is chapter 7.
hmm
And Joey, can you start us off with the definitions, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm really excited because we're now just getting into the meat of this project, which is super exciting.
Yeah.
So before we go any further, we got to talk about what we're actually looking about in terms of hacking capitalism, and we have to start at the foundation, which are resources. So resources in general, it's just it's a supply that's used by a person or an organization in order to function. So you're talking about stuff like natural resources, which are land, air, soil, minerals, things that we extract from nature. But we also be cognizant of there's two different types of natures. There's natural as in nature, as in the earth untouched by humans, and there's also natural resources in terms of our natures and what's in our natural settings or surroundings. So things that are natural to one group of people might not be natural to another. So those are also how people contextualize the next part, which is human resources. So things such as labor being the primary aspect of human resources. So something that is either produced by humans or is either a human itself producing labor in terms of its time invested in that labor act. And those things can be both tangible and intangible. So you can have humans that produce and or use machines or tooling or anything like that, or they produce intangible resources such as intellectual property or patents or other things like art or music. All of these things, essentially result in either a physical, tangible form or an abstracted, intangible form that both have value based on where it is inside a system and what system you're using to evaluate what it's worth. So, and I think that brings us right into discussing resources.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. With resources, we've put resources in here. Joe and I were talking about this before we kicked this off, and it may not be the right place for it, but we definitely wanted to talk about these things in a little more detail to kind of draw the link between resources and capital. And because these things are a problem, as we were talking in the chapter What is Capitalism, capital and labor are always in constant, I don't want to say that they're in conflict, but they sort of are. And it's the ability of capital to employ labor, and that's what gives capital the power. So that's just one resource, labor. So when we're talking about these solutions and resources being the things that we use to create solutions, we need to discuss what these are and how we use them. And specifically in this section here, we're talking about these resources in terms of solving our problems and how the people are going to go about hacking capitalism and how we're going to be able to get access to these resources. Because there's a lot of talk, especially in the US, about redistribution of wealth or redistribution of resources. And to me, it becomes a sticky situation where you're basically going and taking something from somebody. And with property rights being how they are in the United States, it's very, it rubs people the wrong way. So when Joe and I talk about these things and we look at what are these resources and how do we go about obtaining them as people without large amounts of capital to do so, we have to find a resource that we can grab onto. So these resources that are, for now, we can just assume they're out of our reach. The land, water, air, it's like we can't just create manufacturing facilities if we don't have the necessary resources, like the building materials and the raw materials to create the plants and the facilities and all the tools necessary. We may have the labor power, but if we're lacking the capital to obtain these resources, we quickly reach a dead end. So some of these natural resources, again, are land, water, air, anything gold, anything we can abstract from the earth, or even outside of our planetary system. I think we're already talking about mining meteors and trying to pull things from different planets. So it opens up these interesting scenarios, but again, just the layperson doesn't have access to the necessary tools to be able to do those things. So capital is controlling these things already, and through patents, intellectual property, brands, images, these intangible things, that these intangible human resources, and also the tangible resources besides the people, the machinery and the tooling. These are things that take capital to acquire, and we're trying to do this on a budget. So
Yeah. And those are great points. And the thing that you should really think about in terms of where we're going with this data as a resource is to look in the past and look at what paradigm shifts have occurred up to this point. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, we went from nature as either a sublime spiritual state or a religious type condition that was very qualitative, didn't have a value or a certain context of metric attached to it that made it quantitative. It was just out there. But then the process of modernization took that natural state and turned it into something that was mechanized, something that was quantifiable, and something that was commodifiable, and to where natural resources became a commodity within capital itself, became a form of capital. And then humans, via both intangible and tangible means, took this and exacerbated it. So in the modern era industrialization, it was all about taking raw materials and turning them into goods, and then also providing services on top of that. So in this postmodern era, where we're shifting away from that manufacturing type thing inside the US, Europe, other highly developed nations, we're moving away from that service into this now more service-based, intangible type capital type economy, where we are selling services and playing off exchange rates to provide or to produce value. And I think those have massive implications in terms of what data represents in terms of that next stage in exchange value or recapturing what we're trying to define as value inside of a new type of thought process, new paradigm shift, because we're overdue for a paradigm shift. We're overdue for a disruption that takes what has happened in the postmodern era, what has been defined traditionally as postmodern, and move it into a new 21st century paradigm of what is value for a person and how can that person capitalize on their value.
Definitely. And this is one of the best ways to do that, is just to look out into the world and see what's working. And if we look at what has come about in the last 20 to 30 years, it's a technological revolution, or evolution. And the reason specifically is that they've capitalized on resources that other people have not, and that specifically is data. So we have very specific case studies to pull from, or situations to pull from, and observe and learn from. And this is, Silicon Valley is a great example. They're using our data for their purpose. Now they're capitalizing on data. The important thing here to understand is it's their data at this juncture. They're the ones that are controlling it. And even though it's us producing it, they're the ones that are holding on to it. And it's no different from the capitalistic system that we have, where humans, scientists, engineers create these wonderful ideas and then implement them, and the corporation patents them and then owns them. And it's the same kind of data theft is happening there, only in that way it was just a different era. It was a different world. And this transition into a more information age creates these situations where small companies can create tremendous wealth in very short periods of time. And that, again, it kind of points back to what is capitalism, and what are the issues with capitalism. And that right there to me screams problem. If you can take 15 people, create $1 billion of value, and spread that amongst those 15 people, now those people have tremendous capital. We've again taken that wealth and distributed it to very few, and it's not too much different than the past. Only, instead of oil and gold and diamonds and these natural resources that people have controlled by force, they this data thing is new. So you have these new paradigms that happen, and what we're seeing here is for example, in 2013, Instagram was 15 months old when it sold its 30 million users to Facebook for $1 billion. The 13 employees shared 10% of the sale price. 13 people in 15 months created $1 billion of value. And this is it's like the gold rush, right? It's like all of a sudden something new, something newly available, and everybody is leaping at it. So within Silicon Valley, you have so many of these startups and so much capital being poured into it because the people who have money want to continue to make money and control money. So what they do is they invest into these things. And I think in the case of Instagram, Joe and I were discussing, it was something like 50% of that went to the venture capitalists and investors. And that's a lot of money in a short period of time because they were unlikely funded right out of the gate. So what we're talking about here is, the 30 million users is the resource. It's their data. Instagram is a picture sharing app. So Instagram itself was not taking pictures. They weren't doing any value to those pictures besides giving the people some tools to take their pictures and modify them, but really make them Instagram's pictures. So another interesting case study 7 years earlier is YouTube in 20 months sold its users to Google for 1.65 billion, and there were 65 employees. So we can see that 7 years later, it took them less time, less resources, and in this specific case, they exited with less money. But I really want to point out here is it's the users, and what they're doing is they're selling users. I mean, make no mistake about it. These companies are getting the attention of users and then selling those users to whether it's a public exchange or continue to be private, and they generate some investment. It's the users that they're selling, and there's specific metrics behind this, and there's charts and stuff that we'll include in the book that show the different values per user for different companies, and how that value was placed on those users. And it's a very typical metric in Silicon Valley to use. So what is Joe, would you like to add anything there before I move on to that next section there? What is data?
Yeah. I actually want to tie both those sections together in something
Great.
that I forgot to make explicit but probably should have, and that's the relationship between technology and innovation. So you're right. Back in the day, people took advantage of data that other people didn't have. So knowledge used to be stored in books, and is still, for a large part, still stored in books. But those books are now becoming digital. They're being stored in places like Wikipedia, in places where people don't have direct control over their data. And it's becoming increasingly digital, throughout the world, not just in developed countries, places all around the world. They're being transformed from their qualitative states into a quantitative data store of some sort, whether they're storing geospatial points of their villages or taking counts of their cattle and the type of cattle they have. Everybody and everything is being digitized, if it's satellite imagery, whatever. The point I'm driving at with the Silicon Valley thing is that, they will take your data because they have the technology to attract people in, to get to use the technology, to give them their data for free and using end user license agreements. But then also they also steal not just your data, but they also steal your time, because users will submit pictures and comments and tweets and whatever, but they will also developers will also go in there and use the API for free, which means that they're not just stealing data from users, but they're also stealing time from developers who want to build stuff on top of that. So essentially, places like Instagram, places like YouTube will use free developer labor to get more innovation for their systems and more interconnection between new innovation that makes them more valuable in the long run for nothing.
Yeah.
So it's not just one layer of data being a resource that they're using and taking away from you, but they're also finding ways to leverage that data resource to take things such as your socially necessary labor time and ultimately that exchange value that you have in terms of what you're producing versus what you're actually getting. So just remember, if there's a free service on the internet, it's not free, people. You got to keep that in mind.
Yeah, there's a common expression, if what is it? It's something about if you are the product, if you don't,
If you're not paying for the product, you're the product. Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, great points. And it really, what we're talking about here is I think there's several things that happen, and it kind of clouds what's really going on. And one of those things is, before I move on to what is data here, for example, Napster, back in, I don't know, was it the late 90s, early 2000s, when they took the world by storm. Peer to peer, it's sharing. The internet is meant to distribute information, data, and the problem with these file sharing services is not a problem. It's innovation. It's what we need to do. The problem is that the people who controlled past tense the data, the distribution of records or books or media in general, these distributors controlled between the content producer and the viewer, so they were able to create an enormous amount of wealth, and specifically because they controlled the content, the data. And when, instead of looking at peer-to-peer sharing as innovation and as better distribution, they fought it because they're the only ones that had anything to lose by these technologies. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, because sometimes when we look at an old system and we look at a weakness or a strength, we don't always view it with the right perspective. And I think that it really needs to be understood that these file sharing networks, for example, they're not a bad thing. I mean, technology is not bad or good. It's just how it's used, and even the way it's being used, it's not good or bad. I mean, it's cutting out somebody who wants to maintain their control, and of course that entity is going to fight as hard as they can to keep that control, whether or not it's good for the consumer. And that's this is what Hacking Capitalism is about. It's about taking the power back, specifically from corporations and governments, and returning that power to the people, because the people are the content creators. There's no corporations creating content. There's corporations hiring people to create content, but there's no corporations creating content. So I think it's just a very important distinction there that needs to be made, that we're really talking about returning the power of the data, the ownership, to the people. So what is data? We say it's the turning point of the revolution. It's really where we can take control of what we can take control of with what we have. It gives you the value that you need and desire. Right now, your data is only what you have done. We need to focus on attention and intention. And so this is a really important point to be made here when we talk about data. Most people think about data as, and not just a layman's understanding of data. Even in Silicon Valley, data is something that's stored. And when we think of that, why would Facebook or Instagram or any of these companies store your data long term for you without any kind of payment being made? The reason is that your intention is to go back to that site or service and do something. So data can be thought of in three tenses. The past tense of data, which is the stuff people always think about. It's the stored data. It's always a representation of something that has happened. If it's audio, it's something somebody said, not something somebody is saying. If it's a video, it's the same thing. It's always a past tense thing. The attention, the data the current tense of data, attention, is what's coming out of the person's mouth as they speak before it can be recorded. It's this very fine line between past and future, and it's happening right now as I speak. It's coming out of my mouth into the microphone, and it's happened. That's it. It's done.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, before I get to the reason that's important, intention is the future tense of data. So I intend to say something. Joe and I intended to broadcast live 2 hours ago,
Yeah.
but technical difficulties on my end pushed that off. So our intention did not meet our attention, and therefore something happened. And it's just as important in a transaction. I may intend to go down to a store and buy something, but if along the way I see a billboard that same thing is half price down the street somewhere else, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I intended to do. My attention has been captured by somebody or something else. So when we think about data in these different tenses, it's important. To me, the best way that sums this up is Facebook. Is an example about Facebook. Facebook stores your data because you intend to come back and look at it. And they know that when you come back and look at it, they now have your attention. And again, attention is the most valuable form of data. It's the only thing we really have. We only have the now. There's all sorts of philosophy on living in the now and why we have this present moment and what it means. But to marketers, to corporations, that attention is so important because that's the part of you that hands over cash. That's the part of you that hands over your attention so that they can plant seeds for future intention. And the more intention they can place for you to come back to them or to buy something in the future, the more profit that they stand to make. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that this is data, past, present, and future? It matters because we can no longer think of data as just that past. An incoming phone call, as soon as you lift that phone up and look at it, it's got your attention. Now, whether you intend to pick it up based on the number, based on the caller ID, that's a different story. But that attention is what is important, and that's what's valuable. So moving forward, into the next section, talking about value of data. Before I do, I'd like Joe to talk about what data is, if I maybe missed something, or if there's something you'd like to add.
Yeah, like I said, you did a really good point of pulling out the present, but I'm gonna do what I usually do is I'm gonna go into the past and try to look at, because when we talk about a turning point of the revolution, necessity and desire, attention and intention, revolution in terms of we're going around in circles. History is bound to repeat itself. We're at a point right now where we're in a cycle of where we were 1,000 years ago when we had lords and serfs were largely illiterate. The clergy and or the lords had the monopoly on data, which was written and read knowledge. Now, what does that mean in terms of necessity and desire? People desire to have a simple life, a safe life, but that comes with compromise and freedoms. And that's a necessity that compromises a necessity you constantly need to engage with. So we're coming around, talking about the revolution. We're at a turning point now in this revolution where the literacy isn't written, spoken, read language. It's digital literacy. It's computer literacy. It's the literacy of the internet, the World Wide Web, and your data. How is your data produced? Where is it stored? And how do you interact with your data? If you're not literate on how these things are going, your attention, which is just a symbol for your time, is completely juxtaposed with the intention of recapitalizing your control over that data. So if your time isn't being invested in increasing your literacy on these things, you don't know how to define your data, and therefore you cede that power of security for a ton of freedom with what you get to do with it. And ultimately, you're losing that value every second of every day if you're not totally in tune with how it's being produced, stored, and interacted with.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Great points. That in getting into value, I mean, that's, data
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
it's a representation of the self, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
what we are, what we do, whether captured or not. And Joe brings a great point. I mean, it's not just what you're doing; it's about your ability to capture those past data points. And
Mm-hmm.
that there's a there's a good point about equality to be had there, which
Mm-hmm.
is, are we're only truly equal if we have equal access to our time. And that's where capital allows that to really blow out of proportion, because now if one person has a bunch of capital, now they can do 100 times the amount of work as somebody else who doesn't have access to that capital, can't hire those resources. So when when we're talking about the value of data, it's important to understand that the value is, yes, it's the attention and intention, and it's also our ability to capture that, our ability to have multiple sensors and things to be able to capture these things. It's, whether you're at home and you have monitors, somebody who has wealth and can afford a bunch of monitors and sensors around their house to be able to monitor them, they have access to more information. They can do more
Yeah.
with it. They can, you know they can they can adjust the temperature of their house. They can save money on their electric. They can take vitals from the people in, on the property, and know more about stuff. And that's information, what we're gathering from that data. So the value is, it's not just that we can't really just put a number on that data in terms of a value. But I wanted to make the point that value is it's different for Joe than it is for me. It's also
Mm-hmm.
an intrinsic thing. So it's not just a data point. The value of your data based on your ability to capture and analyze the data. The value is in the time it took to produce it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's value, and it's not to be able to measure this specifically, but it's to say that our past data has a value, our attention has a value, and our intention has a value. So how do we utilize that value, since it's something that, again, it's always oozing from us. At every point we have our attention is to be had, and it has value, and are we maximizing that value or not? It'd be almost like sweating gold, right? It's like
Yeah.
you're constantly just excreting this thing that has
Mm-hmm.
value, and maybe in a small amount, if you're not able to properly capture it, and it kind of just dissipates into the air. But if we're able to capture it, it's got more value. And if
Mm-hmm.
we can add value to that by doing something different, we have that opportunity. But if we're not able to, right, because we cannot sweat gold, we have to go somewhere to get it. And if we're not controlling that resource, which most of us don't, capital does, then we are at a loss of value, and somebody else has the upper hand on us. So specifically in the case of this, we see that 30 million users sold to Facebook for $1 billion. So what does that mean? What is the value there? Well, okay, it's the value is $1 billion. What are we talking about? We're talking about 30 million users. We're talking about the fact that Facebook bought 30 million people, 30 million people's attention at any given time for $1 billion. And none of those 30 million people were asked whether that was okay with them. That's their data as far as we're concerned, but it's not. It's not, because the terms of services say that it's not. So because Facebook is storing that data, or Google is storing that data, or any of these other companies are storing that data, that's their value to be had, so far as terms of service tell us. So
Mm-hmm.
what can we really do about that? Is there, Joe, do you want to add anything before we start talking about taking control of that data back?
Well, I think I'm acting as the bridge for this thing,
Yeah,
between sections.
perfect.
But I think I was actually just looking for a more recent example of the LinkedIn sale to
Microsoft,
Microsoft,
yeah, good point.
and that was an extremely large sale, and that was once again that was all about user data. Microsoft had no other interest aside from that user data, because that's a whole new market for them. It was an untapped resource of mid-level to upper-level professionals that had an extreme depth of knowledge built around the schema that was the user profile. So, and not just quantitative, but the huge amounts of natural language processing, unstructured text data that was there, just waiting to be analyzed and capitalized on, so they could recommodify that.
Yeah, it was
So when we're
it was the business social network that
yeah, yeah,
they failed to create social networks on several occasions now.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so and business has always been their thing. I mean, we can say that Apple
yeah,
has had their
yeah.
successes with the iPhone and with the
No,
with
it's
store, but they that's purely consumer market. The iPhone doesn't exist inside enterprise or government. I mean, at a
no.
very 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 limited degree. So if military, government, and enterprise, I mean,
Mm,
again, we're talking about capital, and we're talking about how big these entities can be and how much they can control capital. Um, Really, the iPhone's kind of irrelevant in the consumer market as far as everyone's concerned, except though it shows you the power of the consumer. It shows you the power
yeah.
of getting into the hands of the person rather than the corporation. And to Joe's point, Microsoft did what they did, and they showed the value of data.
Yeah, and like I said, just building off this and going to the next section, it's like data's representation. Once again, we're talking about those intangible human, things that we don't think about. When we buy something at a store, part of that sale price is them buying the data point that you, with your credit card, sold that thing. When your child is born inside of a hospital, that child gets a serial code attached to it, and it's scanned at every station in that hospital. You know, every day, every moment of the day, we're being quantified, and we're not just a data point, but that's the way they treat us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up to us to, once again, gain that literacy, capture, analyze your own data, and then recapture that value. Find the means and the modes to recapture that value transaction, so that you're in control, instead of ceding that control to someone else that's going to leverage that exchange value in their favor. And it's when we talk about taking control of your data, that's what we're talking about. And I'll let Todd wrap it up here.
Thanks. So yeah, how do we take control of this? Right? It seems complicated. It seems like something that may be difficult, but we have two perfect case studies here that show that 13 people can do it, 65 people can do it. So
Mm.
it's taking less people. I mean, in 2006 it took 65, in 2013 it took 13. So what's to say that in 2016 it can't take two? So
Yeah.
when we're talking about taking control of your data specifically, how do we do this? You need to seize control of your data and create value for you and society. What do we mean by this? We mean it's not just about it's about you. It starts with the individual, because if the individual doesn't take control, it it's it it makes it a little more difficult. Because for example, let's take health information. If the user is taking their health information instead of their iWatch, I don't know if it takes a pulse or not, but instead of Fitbit or whatever, taking this data and then doing something with, again, Microsoft's a
Mm.
great example. They have the Microsoft Band. It
Yeah.
takes the data, it pushes it up to the cloud where they control your data. They have access to it, and they use that data on mass scale to make their products better, to understand humans better. Google Google can predict the flu outbreak 2 weeks before the CDC. That's that's crazy. How they do that? They do that because they're monitoring search results, and people are searching for flu symptoms or runny nose or whatever it may be, and they're able to tell where the outbreak is occurring and how fast, and they're getting that information before the person goes to the doctor, before the doctor reports that. It's already known. So Microsoft, these companies have that same advantage. They know the data coming off of you, and what we're talking about is it's not just about control for you, it's about
Mm.
control for society. So it's so much better for society to have this open and transparent view into public health. and not allow corporations to control it and profit from it. So
Mhm.
so how do we give the people control, and how do we include all people? Well, I think there's a lot of ways to execute on this, and that's the fun of writing this book here and the
Yeah.
future chapters. So we don't want to get too much into this specifically, because I think I forget the name of the next chapter, but we're going right into how to do this. So how are we
Yeah.
going to take control? We're going to, we're going to attack on, I think, on several fronts here. We're going to, I think, hacking capitalism, while it's a blueprint, it's also a way for Joe and I to, and anybody else who's including themselves here, it allows us to kind of explore these options and shake these things out. And we've talked in the
Mhm.
past about replacing Uber or replacing Facebook or any of these different technologies. How do we give the people control? We start by creating the solution,
Mhm.
and part of that solution is giving the ownership of that data to the people. And it's not a permission based thing like it should be. It's We're saying, just like Facebook or anybody else, we're saying, no, that data is ours, but we're going to give it back to you. So we're saying that data is really yours, and it's a
Yeah.
totally different proposition. And I think why we talked last time about Wikipedia as being a kind of a model for some of this in certain ways.
Yeah.
It's it's that idea that we can have something that's there for social good. And if we can give you control of your data so that you control it, so it's yours. I think one of the biggest things that one of the biggest problems that we've run across in recent times here is the difference between privacy and ownership. We're talking about Right now, we talk about privacy as an issue, and that concedes ownership. It immediately concedes ownership. It says, this data is not mine, so how are you going to use it, corporation?
Mhm.
What is my privacy rights in this transaction? Instead of just saying, no, this data is mine, and corporation, would you like to purchase it from me? How would you, what part of this information would you like to purchase? And it allows control to be had by the people, and this happens through building solutions that allow people to control their data. So um, what it's hard for me right now, Joe, to know which direction to take here, because I
Well,
don't want to
it's
say too much, but
well. I think for me to wrap up the chapter,
uh
we have to look back to a pretty traditional term when we talk about resources, which is tragedy of the commons. It used to be about natural resources and carrying capacity limits for humans on the natural environment. But now with hacking capitalism, we're talking about shifting that paradigm forward. We're talking about what is the true carrying capacity for corporations in terms of them extracting resources of humans. How much can they take from us before we're exhausted and there's too much weight from them on top of us doing this exploitatively
mm,
over time?
mhm,
And once again, it goes back to understanding what a neo resource is now. What you as a human are producing on a day-to-day basis inside these systems that you just kind of walk through without considering. But you need to start becoming literate on these things, because taking control of data and taking control of that value, it entails implicitly that you understand what you're doing, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and how that equates to where these systems take it from into this ether, this black box, and then produces things on the other side. You need to take the veneer off that box and really demand to look in the inside and say, hey, you've taken something from me without my consent, or you've taken something that was extremely undervalued and I want it back. You need to hit the brakes, start asking the questions, and start redefining that paradigm. Otherwise, how are we going to get people control? How are we going to get all people included? It's going to be impossible, because we've, over time, especially in the last few decades, we've really ceded that freedom for security.
mhm.
We need to start asking, is that the right paradigm going forward? Do we need to start asking and demanding more of ourselves before we start saying, oh, well, I can donate dollars to overseas for some kind of disaster, but that's not really solving the fact that the area in which the disaster occurred was extremely remote in terms of its economic reach, extremely remote in terms of its resource reach. And by us throwing a essentially a layered facade, which is the currency money, at them, we're not really throwing anything at them. We're throwing something that's useless at them.
Mm-hmm.
We're not giving them any real value. What we could be doing instead is going, okay, well, there's a revolution here, there's a disaster here. How can we help them create a new economy based on what they're doing? News media's over there. How do we get them to get paid for those interviews, get paid for the video and for the audio and for all the things that they're essentially making money off of? How do we get them to do that? How do we get them money from aid NGOs? When the NGOs go out there to collect data or to provide some kind of service, how do we get them to get paid for those things? That's the real question. And I think in terms of us and what we can do here, we're talking about the most immediate thing, which is essentially what we're doing right now. We're talking about data being committed onto systems in which we have zero control over. How do we take that power back?
Yeah, and I think this, the Silicon Valley examples here, just a couple, right? These are just two examples.
2 out of hundreds, yeah.
Facebook as an example of in its value, right? So it doesn't take much if we have zero capital and we can put 13 people on something for 15 months and create $1 billion of value. Well, now we have capital. So now replacing eBay and PayPal and Google and every other technology company out there becomes just a matter of time. And then we have real capital. And we really have more capital than those that control the natural resources have, because what we're doing is we're re-empowering the people to understand their value as a laborer, and as a laborer of as a laborer of value or data creation, maybe. And this gives the people the idea that no, it's ours, and it really puts the power back in the people's hands in terms of what it means to have this data, and what it means to say I want something instead of what do I want, right? With corporations, they're telling us what we want. Well, if we the people just understand that what we want and need, and we just say what we want and need, and there's a system that can fulfill those needs for us, that's way more efficient than a corporation going, I wonder what they want and need, and now let's make it, and now let's tell them they want it, and then if that doesn't work, then well, we'll just write it off. And all those wasted resources, all those man hours, all those natural resources just are it's a write-off. It's nothing. It's a waste. And what we're talking about is let's use data to not only take control of our data self, but also take control over our manufacturing and our production.
Yeah, and I think it's like I said, it's what Michel Foucault referred to as this paradigm between knowledge and power. The more knowledge you have, the more power you have, which that means getting out there, learning these things, and really engaging with them so that you can leverage that for future value creation for yourself and for your social spheres, your society. His work was some initial works were looking at the healthcare industry and looking at prisons and looking at how knowledge power is also related to this idea of obfuscation. If you start, as time has progressed, we've started obscuring aspects of healthcare. We started obscuring aspects of crime and punishment. And when you start removing that the public view on these things, you cede any kind of control over those systems. So we have demographic groups being exploited within the criminal system. We also have people being exploited inside the medical system, and it's because the public has no purview in those areas. They have no insight into those areas because it's been raised above them education-wise, but it's also been corporatized, been commodified, and ultimately been encoded using specific languages to make sure that the public has no power over those systems. So they can't fight back against high healthcare prices. They can't fight against a criminal system that's constantly trying to get numbers instead of actually taking care of people that might have mental illnesses. It's a travesty. So once again, data is just the next step in that revolution. It's engage with it, gain knowledge over it, and take your power back, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about hacking capitalism so that you can get that knowledge power paradigm in your favor instead of someone else's.
Perfect. I love it, Joe. It's fantastic, man. I think that's it.
Yeah, that's about all I got. Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, Joe.
Yep. Thanks all. Bye.